Hey, welcome everybody. Lindy, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you here. Lindy comes with just a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the form of all things trauma. She has a ton of experience developing programs, and she has just really poured her blood, sweat, tears, and passion into this idea of the human brain and the body, and that it can heal, and what attachment does to us, and what trauma can do to us, and then how we can serve others that have experienced all of those things. So, Lindy, I would love for you to give us just a brief introduction of who you are, why you are here, and what makes you so passionate about this topic.
Yeah, well, thank you again so much for having me. It's so fun to get to see your faces as we dive in and talk through some big things that are really important to all of us. Yeah, a little bit about me. So I started studying social work early on. I knew I had a heart for the vulnerable through actually early family mission trips. I just got to see the world and that like pain is pain, hardship is hardship. It looks different in different contexts, and yet it just there's something about that it drew me to what I wanted to, the role I wanted to play as a helper. So once I got to college, I ended up studying social work, and I knew I also was really passionate about foster care and adoption and family. So it just kind of morphed over years. And as I was working towards my master's, this whole concept of like trauma, early childhood trauma specifically, and attachment, just like I just couldn't get enough. I wanted to read everything and attend everything and whatnot. And so through my work with nonprofits, or I did a few years working in private practice as a therapist, or just advocacy kind of trauma training stuff, it's all kind of anchored for me in the fact that we were hardwired for some of this good stuff that we'll get into. And when trauma and hardship and life, and for me as someone who loves Jesus, when we look at when sin enters that, it shifts things. That's what I've really tried to lean into of, okay, well, what do we do about that? How do we understand it? Where are we limited? What can I do as someone who cares for others? So certainly I don't have all the answers, but I've really just tried to lean into that and caring for people when we see that kind of crossroad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very cool. Well, we're excited to learn from you today. Why don't you start by just orienting all of us, laying a foundation, assume we know nothing. What is trauma? Like, give us your best definition of what trauma is.
Yeah, I'm sure there are more out there. One of my favorites is the actual or perceived experience of danger, of threat, right? So most of us, our most common connection to trauma might be a dangerous event, like something that actually threatened your life, right? It's like there was a car accident, or there was some kind of threat by person. But I think it's super important, and what I love trying to hone in on is equally as important versus what actually happened is how the person perceived a threat or their level of safety, right? So maybe we were with them during an event, and like we knew we were okay, like we knew, oh, that was happening over there, or like we weren't in the line of threat or whatever.
Right.
But did the person with us, or did the person or even ourselves, did they perceive the same thing we did? Right. So that's where with trauma, there's a lot of room of like, we can, like, let's say we revisited the scene of the crime, and it's like, oh no, they were okay. Okay. Something happened over here. They were right here. So they were fine. They were out of the line of threat, for instance. But our bodies don't always know that, right? There's a difference between like me as a bystander and you experiencing it. So I really like to hone in on that perception piece, because it leaves a lot of room for, well, I don't know how your body experienced that, or how your brain experienced that.
Right.
Maybe I could see a detailed list of what actually happened, but it's different when we check in on their body reacting, if that makes sense. So that's a definition, a concept that I think just helps kind of get the spectrum of it. Again, there's probably a lot out there, but that's the one that I use the most as far as just defining trauma.
What frames that up? So with the idea that your perception is your reality, what's trauma for you might not be trauma for me. Is that fair to describe it in that way?
Exactly. For instance, I've worked a lot, my background is a lot in the foster care space and the adoption space, right? So working a lot with families. And that's where, multiple children being raised in the same environment might have different impacts. Maybe they perceived different things as more threatening than the other. So not that like one was untouched by trauma and one was highly traumatized, right? Not necessarily that extreme, but maybe one sibling, let's say, experienced that event to be hugely traumatic. Like
Right.
maybe it's something that follows them for years. Whereas the other sibling was like, no, that wasn't the thing. This was the thing that really hit me more in that moment. So there's again, a lot of room for, yes, how we all differently experience and perceive events.
Yeah. What do you think is one of the largest misconceptions that people have about trauma coming from a place of very little knowledge in the space of mental health? What's a common misconception?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. One is that, oh, it happened so long ago. Like you were only 3 years old, like you were 5 years old, or that was 20 years ago. The conception or the idea or belief that it happened so long ago, you should be fine by now, or it shouldn't have really touched you because you were so young. What could you even remember? Now, again, it's like my experience and exposure has primarily been with childhood trauma, which is just has some nuances versus trauma that happened as adults. And so I think that whole idea of, let's say we're working with, or we're caring for, or we're interacting with whatever our context is in relationship to a middle schooler. And they've been in a safe environment, let's say, since they were 10 months old, right? So maybe the first 10 months, like it wasn't a safe, or it was chaotic, or it was disruptive. But like since 10 months old, we know they've been pretty stable. We cannot ignore those first 10 months. And even what was the pregnancy like with that child or that individual?
Right.
So I think a common misconception is oh, well, if it happens so early on, they won't be very touched by that. When actually, if you think about anything that you know about child development, so a couple of things is right. When you think about early on, if you've been around an infant, if you have an infant, if you've cared for an infant, you know how needy they are, right? Early on, like you, the adult, are the epitome of keeping them alive and safe, fully dependent. So when you think about how needy they are in a good way, in a thoughtfully designed way, when there's something that's not available at that time, or when there's something that was chaotic or unsafe, like we're also absorbent in those first months of life, right? Like think about how quickly little ones learn language skills, or like fine motor skills, or all of those things. It's like our brains are just sponges early on.
Right.
So therefore, if there's negative or toxic or stressful or chaotic experiences, events, there's a huge impact to that, even though they might not explicitly remember, oh, at 5 months old, this really horrible thing happened. The body and the brain absorb that and are absolutely impacted by it. So I think that's a really common misconception of it happened so long ago. The other one I think that comes to mind is maybe kind of to the other extreme is you'll never progress from your trauma. Like, oh, if you've got major trauma, like you're kind of ruined for life.
Right.
Now, there's a whole spectrum here. I would say, yes, that person may always be impacted by their trauma, just due to the nature of our design, our bodies, our brains, how intelligently they remember and store memories. But to kind of counter that, we also have so much information and research and data and long-term research and long-term data, right? Not just new and fresh, but about how our brains and our bodies can heal. There's certainly different levels to that. There's kind of like the mind thinking level of healing. There's the biology, physiology level of healing, right? There's the emotional, relational level of healing. Like there's all of these levels to it. So there's not like a quick formula for you, but we do know without a doubt, there's so much hope for true, genuine, authentic healing as well. So those are two misconceptions that do come to mind.
Yeah, that's easy to get lost in, especially as we're working with very vulnerable populations. So every
Mhm.
woman on this call is in the trenches
Yeah.
with people that I would say the vast majority, if not all, have experienced trauma in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's a really good call out that you make of the it happened so long ago. And even these mothers that are now raising children who at very young ages are experiencing some form of trauma.
Mhm.
Let's get into how trauma affects, let's hone in on this vulnerable moms who are in crisis, moms who may feel like they're in imminent danger, who are at risk of losing their children into the foster care system, and some moms with children in foster care.
Mhm.
How does trauma affect the most vulnerable and their children? And I will point out that every mother that comes through the EMA program, we do a comprehensive assessment of, and we're able to get her trauma score. And so for advocates on this call, what do they need to know about if a mom has experienced severe or significant trauma? How has that affected her?
Oh, hugely. So again, to hone in on early trauma and or like childhood trauma, right? Well, okay, let me start with this. The biggest indicator of, and you all probably know this information as well, and then just the nature of what you do. The biggest indicator of children coming into the foster care system is mom's history with child welfare.
Mm,
Right. And so it's like because it becomes very cyclical. Because if I was raised in that and that's all I know, it's going to take a lot of work or effort to change that. Because all of us, trauma or not, we parent the way we were parented, right? Like
right.
it's how it works, right? Unless we're mindful and really do a lot of work to change the things we didn't like or that weren't helpful or safe, and to maybe maintain what was good and beneficial. Um, so I think about this is certainly an assumption on my end. I'm assuming a lot of the women you're serving have had histories touching child welfare.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a huge impact. So that's just something to be mindful of, right? Of, okay, well, how do we pay attention to that? How do we, of course, lean in and support in the best ways we know how? But just on a trauma side of the impact for, well, one, if mother had a history of child welfare early on, and or if child welfare never got involved, but
Mhm.
home was not safe, was scary, was unpredictable, was chaotic, was disruptive, those things absolutely impact our brain development, our relational development, our emotional development, right? Touches all of how we grow and develop. And therefore, I've actually seen in a lot of my work where, of course, these women are doing the best that they can
Mhm.
with what they've been given, while also recognizing a lot of the women I've served, they haven't been given a lot early on.
Mm,
So they don't have a lot to work with. They're not bad people. They're not bad parents. They're not malicious. They're
mhm.
also not hopeless, right? Like there's a lot that we can do in one, loving them, seeing them, caring for them, but also giving, of course, those practical supports. Um, but I think about the trauma component being the way they think is going to be different.
Mm,
The way they problem solve is going to be different. The way they um, maybe assess priorities in problem solving, right? It might be
right.
different than me, an observer or a helper or an outside person might be like, oh, no, 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 this is where we need to start. But maybe they're fixated over here, right? It just disrupts
Mm,
so much if there's early trauma. So in my line of work, again, a lot working with kids, in the foster adopt space or the adoptive families. My roles have not been hands-on with the biological families as much. So that's where you all have a line of expertise that I don't even. But something that I'm mindful of is in the nature of who I've served, there's this kind of general rule of thumb that if there was early childhood trauma for this teen, this young adult, this person in their 50s, there's a level of understanding that when we know trauma disrupts development, they may be chronologically 32 years old.
mm,
but they might function emotionally, developmentally, all of those things, relationally, closer to about half their age.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe let's say you're working with a 32-year-old woman, and in your life, you have other 32-year-olds in your life. They can maintain this, they can hold these jobs, they can care for their kids to this capacity. But maybe with this woman who's had a really traumatic or hard or chaotic early life experience, she might function more like a 16 or 17-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Again, not a bad person, not malicious, not hopeless. But it's helpful when we have that lens. So for me, I've often worked with the kiddos. That's been a lot of my role. And I remember actually working with, there was a kiddo who had a disrupted adoption. And when he first came to work with me, he was about, I think 9 or 10 years old, but he also was a big kid. Like, he was tall, he was broad, but he also looked older, right? So when I'm looking at him, I'm thinking, you should be able to XYZ behavior, track with me when we're problem solving or whatever, right? So I certainly walked in with a list of expectations. But the more I worked with him and the more I learned about his story little by little over a couple years, I remember that light bulb moment of when I learned this concept of the chronological age versus developmental and emotional age, when that clicked for me. And I was like, at this point now, he was about 11. I realized he liked playing with toys that were more appropriate to like my 4 or 5-year-old nephews.
Wow.
Like toy dinosaurs and a dinosaur book, right? Like things that matched. When I just looked at his level of play and engagement, it clicked for me of, oh, I'm expecting this list. He's functioning here. So what does that look like for me to shift my expectation, shift the way I communicate, the way I maybe ask questions, the way I engage, the way maybe I'm playful with him at a different level, right? Like, I would adjust my playfulness to a 4 or 5-year-old versus a 11, 12-year-old, right? And so that's an example of what it looked like with a child. Kind of the same principle if we're working with adults, of not that you're going to talk to them like they're 4 years old,
Right.
or treat them like they're an adolescent who knows nothing. That's not what I mean. I mean, shifting your expectations and maybe even asking and checking in on, to what level are they able to complete this thing I'm asking for, problem solve in the way I think should be easy in this situation. Does that make sense? Of course, maybe later we can get into some examples, but just that concept, I think, is big.
100%. And I think that many of us would say that we've experienced that already early on. So how do we respond? This question is twofold. One, how do we respond to women who've experienced trauma that may be demonstrating exactly what you're describing, in terms of, do they almost get stuck in this age or time frame of perhaps maybe even when they experienced that trauma, maybe earlier, without jeopardizing the way we treat and love and listen to these women with the inherent dignity that we all believe that they hold, that's in a way that's not condescending to them or degrading, but is very empowering still. And it is our goal to move them out of that frame of mind, or is a better goal to just change our expectations?
Sure. Great questions. And you might track and make sure I don't ignore one of them along the way. But okay, when going back to my example of the 8-year-old who, a couple of years later, around the age of 11, I had that aha moment. Recognizing he functioned more like a 4 or 5-year-old did not change how I treated him with respect, that he was of value, right? Just because he is a valuable person, he matters, right? Like, that did not shift my perspective. So hopefully, if we're adding this lens of just looking for kind of the chronological age, that doesn't actually change their value or worth.
Right.
We of course need to monitor, like, am I now speaking to them like they're immature or whatnot? But I think a couple of things we can do is, one, maybe I think leading with questions, right? Obviously, always wanting to learn and understand, in addition to all the good stuff, like treating them lovingly and respectfully and all of those things, but kind of checking in, maybe even something along the lines of, hey, I've noticed this action or this problem or this thing, it's really overwhelming to you. And I know what it feels like to be overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
How can I help you take one step forward in it? Let's say, I'm going to use some numbers for metrics. Like, let's say you're like at a 3 on a scale of 10 to being able to actually like, I know what I'm doing. I know how to tackle this. I can do it on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe even you asking them like, on a scale of 1 to 10, like, how hard is that for you? How overwhelming is that for you? What's this like for you? To gauge their awareness of that, right? Because they may be like, no, I've got this. And you as the helper might see like, I don't think we're actually moving forward in the goal or the progression of what we're working on. So
Mm-hmm.
I think checking in on their awareness of how overwhelmed they are, because maybe if they've lived in a state of overwhelm their whole life, do they even realize they're overwhelmed?
Right.
So I think there's a lot of questions we can ask, for one, us to learn and to tune in, but to two, also kind of model for her, is she aware of those things? Because that takes a lot of self-awareness to realize like, okay, I'm really overwhelmed. I'm not really making this decision very well. Why don't I take a step back and regulate myself? Right. Like, that's a tough skill that most of us are still learning in adulthood without major trauma in our lives.
Yeah.
So asking questions, I think, to lead her into that self-reflection, and however she responds, you get to then say, yeah, I see that. I totally get that. That's really overwhelming, or that's really hard, right? All
Like
the empathy, of
affirming
course.
that in her. Yeah.
Absolutely. The leading with the affirmation or empathy or whatever you feel like is appropriate as far as like good nutrients in that moment, and following up with, okay, so let's say she picked a number on a scale. You don't have to use a number on a scale. Let's say she's like, yeah, I feel like I'm at like a 4 of feeling like I can tackle this. 10 is like, I got this.
Sure.
4 is like, then I think you could say, okay, that's really helpful to know where you're at. So I don't just come in here and like bombard the situation. What would it look like if for us to bump to a 5, like a 4 to a 5? How can I help you get to a 5? I actually, a very different context, but actually it might be similar for some of what you guys see. I'm not sure. I was working with a group of caseworkers who were specifically serving aging out youth. So these are anywhere from like 16 to 21-year-old youth. And this caseworker was telling me, I've got this 18-year-old who cannot go grocery shopping without me, like cannot do it. And we were talking through and discussing how do we help her like baby step, like essentially wean her off of needing someone to hold her hand through the whole process. And it looked like, okay, I'm going to hang out here by the produce. Why don't you go get your oatmeal and you go get your bread? And I'm in the building, but I'm not walking the aisles with you. And then later on, it was a matter of, I'm going to be standing outside drinking my coffee. I'm here when you check out. Come find me and we'll head home. Like there were baby steps. And then later on, the goal might've been, I'll wait in the car. I'm going to take a phone call and I'll drive you home when you're done. Right. Like I drop you off at the door and I'm waiting when you're done. So like, what are those small progressions for this mom in your context to recognize maybe emotionally, developmentally, this is a lot for her, and help her move forward one step at a time? Does that make sense?
And those small progressions are major wins that we can't discount as advocates. So when we step into this space, I like that you framed up in the beginning with our expectations, define our own win, and not in any way lower our expectations. I don't think it's a lowering of, but it's just a shifting of. And if we can be 1% better, stronger, more resilient, more capable tomorrow than we are today, for all of us, that's a major win. And so, yes, as a mom who's experiencing crisis, to be her guide, to be her advocate, to be her helper is huge. For like, we can never underestimate the power of that, of giving mom, like almost putting the power back into her arms and affirming her capabilities to be able to do this. I want to talk a little bit about not discrediting the fact that many of us, if not all of us, have also experienced trauma in some way, shape, or form. And so what are things that we can be aware of? How does our own trauma impact the way that now we serve other people with trauma in a way that is healthy, in a way that doesn't bring us back, in a way that doesn't make us spiral, and being aware of almost triggers on both sides, if you will?
Totally. That's a really good question, and definitely something we have to be aware of. Um, I always lean into we have to do our work ideally first. Um, we have to do our heart work to lead other people into their heart work. Right. So I'm trained in something called trust-based relational interventions, and that was developed by a woman named Dr. Karen Purvis. And I love that this concept that she's kind of quoted for is, how can you lead someone to a place you've never been?
Mm.
And especially in like the healing, wholeness, trauma conversation, right? Like if I've never dealt with my own grief, I'm going to have a hard time leading you through yours.
Yeah.
If I've never processed all the things that I've lost and experienced that weren't safe or appropriate or helpful for me in my life, I'm going to have a hard time leading you through yours.
Right.
Now, that doesn't change my intention. That doesn't change my heart for you and my desire for you to be well. But we've got to equip ourselves again, ideally first. If it's at the same time, I'll take it. Let's do that. I think that's huge, because if we've not leaned into that, now that doesn't mean I have to have the same lived experience as you in order to help you. Not what I'm saying. But if I haven't leaned into some of mine, I'm going to have a hard time being gracious with yours. I'm going to have a hard time not saying, well, it needs to look like da, 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 right? Like a little list over here. I'm going to be triggered by some of your stuff. And then when I'm triggered, I'm not going to be able to be very helpful for you, because that's kind of the nature of it.
Sure.
Right. And to the idea of, we cannot underestimate the power of modeling. Right. Again, kind of another like helpful little catchphrase is, most behavior is caught, not taught. Meaning I actually absorb a lot more just by being around you or observing you or being exposed to that, than you being like, here's what we're going to do. Don't do this when this happens, and do this when this happens. Right. Yes, we can learn both ways, but most of like our tendencies, our habits, our go-to stuff, that is often absorbed by what was modeled and what we were exposed to. And so when we're talking about our own trauma histories or our own ACE score or whatnot playing a part, the more we're able to address that through things like journaling, support groups, therapy, reading books that apply to what I'm processing, all of those relational experiences that lead me through it. When I'm modeling that, I am way more equipped to, one, love you, the person I'm serving, well, and to be patient and gracious and know when we need structure, or know when we need empathy, or know when we need boundaries. Because boy, have I done my own work, and I've dug in and I've realized, ooh, this is a sign of, we need this boundary. This is a sign of someone being totally triggered. So therefore, like, we need to just focus on calming down. So in us doing our own work, we're actually equipping ourselves in what might be the best way to serve those that we care about in volunteering, and seeing those who are vulnerable, both with, professional spaces, personal spaces, across the board. Did that answer that question?
Yeah. And I think that living in close proximity with and in close relationship with women is the only way we're going to be able to model, versus we're teaching at you. We talk about that within the program of EMA a lot, and the role of this advocate is less and less about the weekly sessions and the content you're feeding them, and so much more about this really deep and meaningful connection you're having with this person. You're earning the right in their life to be heard. And that always comes like, what is the price of admission into someone's life to be able to model, even have that role that you can model behaviors for and with them. Talk to us a little bit about triggers. What do triggers look like? How can we be aware of them? And what do we do when?
Oh, the questions. Yes.
These are loaded questions.
I have a 3-step answer for you. No, I wish I did. I don't.
Mm.
But would be happy to shed some light on it. So ultimately a trigger is, okay, well, let's go back to, let's say, the original traumas in someone's life, right? Those are what's happening in the brain when there's trauma, especially again, early on. The amygdala is overworked. The amygdala is responsible for basically, like, it's fully developed when we are born. Super cool. We're so glad about that, right? It's not like other parts of the brain that keep developing until our mid-20s. This part's like ready to go. Okay.
Yeah.
And its job is to keep us safe, right? So when I'm an infant and I'm hungry, my brain is like, oh, we don't like this. The amygdala is like, this doesn't feel good. We have a need. Cue the crying, right?
Mm.
I'm cold. The amygdala is like, this is uncomfortable. You should cry now. I cry, right? So parent, ideally, the safe caregiver comes and meets my needs, right? So we're really glad the amygdala is like good to go when we are born. When trauma happens, again, if its job is to like scan the room and make sure we're safe, when we're not safe, it's obviously on like high power, right? So it's really active with trauma experiences. So just to give a little context for like the early on trauma experience. So when we've got a trigger, it's some kind of sensory, it can be any of the senses, some relational experience, something that feels familiar to that early experience when the amygdala was like, oh, no, 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 no. We know what happens when we have this emotion. We know what happens when we see that facial expression.
Right.
We know what happens when we smell that weird scent, when we see someone with a black hat, when we, right, whatever the kind of sensory experience was, the amygdala is like, remember back when that was really bad, saying it turns on, right? So the amygdala is assessing this cue or this prompt or this sensory input, whatever it might be, feels too similar to something we've experienced in the past that was really bad. So therefore, I'm going to equip you to run away, to hide, to freeze, right? To respond to the trauma.
Yeah.
So that's what's happening in our brain when we're triggered. It's the amygdala saying, no, 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 we know what happens here.
Get out. Yeah.
Even if I'm actually in a totally different state of life, I'm with totally different people, I'm actually safe. But my perception is when someone starts getting mad at me or someone starts having a conversation to resolve a conflict, my biggest association with that is not good. It was not safe in the past. So if you're in the room, you might be thinking like, what is happening?
On? Yeah.
Like, whoa, I just said, hey, let's have a conversation about what happened yesterday. Let's say that was the interaction. And that person with a trauma history is like, whoa, so they react some way. I love this phrase. If it's hysterical, it's historical. Right. So let's say you're having a conversation with this person and you're saying, hey, let's talk about how that went yesterday. You're calm, you're cool, collected, like you were kind, you didn't like come at them. And they like have some big response and it doesn't really match what just happened. Often that's a good indicator. It's historical. It's actually a reflection of something in their past, in their history. So that just kind of helps us notice that in the moment. So the trigger in their body doesn't know they're actually safe. So when we're truly triggered, our body is saying, you need to run, you need to escape, you need to fight, you need to freeze and check out because this is not a safe scenario. So it's like the amygdala hijacks everything else because that's all it knew from a past experience. Does that make sense as far as what a trigger is?
Yeah, definitely.
So things we can do if we're the person in the room with someone who's triggered, or if we're triggered ourselves, ultimately in that moment, focus on simple, using way less words, maybe even stop talking and just do some deep breathing. Now there can also be the reality. And again, like you've got to read the room and kind of learn in the moment of maybe stop talking feels like I abandoned this person and it could make it worse. So you've got to, we all kind of have to learn in that moment who we're working with. But this idea of use less words, right? And if you use words, keep them simple, like you're safe, I'm here. We'll well, don't say let's calm down. Let's take some deep breaths together. Do you want to go on a walk? Can I get you some water? Right? Like really simple, basic things, because we have to help the brain and the body come back to the present. And the present is there's actually not a threat here.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that means we just need to get some water, get them a snack, right? There's also some research, psychology, and even just like physiological research that shows like if we can suck on something sweet, it's kind of a calming sensation in our body, like a peppermint. Or, I mean, honestly, when I work with kids, we use a lot of dum-dums, right? Just the sucking sensation is calming. Something like bubble gum, maybe even just like stepping outside, getting fresh air, going on a short walk. And maybe we're not talking. It's just like, hey, let's go get some air. And we just walk until they can kind of come back and converse again. But I would like simplify anything you can. If you're out in a public place, try to get somewhere where there's less stimulation, right? Like, do we need to sit in the car? Do we need to sit on the patio? Whatever it might be, I would focus on that. And of course, there's things like deep breathing, right? Like that just physically helps our heart rate come down. Even drinking, it helps my body realize like I'm doing an action right now that requires me to kind of be present with it. So some of these really simple things help bring back to the present.
Right.
So those are a couple really simple, like not really rocket science. We can all generally do those wherever we are serving someone who is maybe triggered in that moment.
And if a mom that we're serving withdraws, hangs up, leaves, is done, walls go up, and she's checked out, do we give that space? Do we give mom the space she needs in that moment?
Yeah. If someone's truly triggered, I would suggest exploring how can I be present still? And if that means I text her and say, I can see you're overwhelmed. I'm here for you. I'm so sorry that was overwhelming. I'm ready to talk whenever you are. When you're ready, I'm here. I'll come over. I'll call you. I'll get on Zoom, whatever it might be. I would like honor the space, because there's so much of like, if they don't know what to do in that moment, you can't force them to like be really intentional and have this heart to heart with you. That's going to feel scary. That's going to feel foreign.
Right.
And that could actually be, we could trigger more if we like force that. So until that mother has learned to stay connected to you in the moment, I wouldn't push it. But thinking through what can I do or say or communicate presence, any kind of connection you can still offer that's not invasive, right? If she walks away or she hangs up or whatnot, exploring what's a little way I can say, I'm here for you. I'm so sorry. That was a really hard moment. That was a really overwhelming experience for you. I'm available. Call me when you're ready. Text me when you're ready. Whatever you think is appropriate. I would just focus on like being present and communicating. I am still here. Like you didn't scare me off.
Wow.
Like maybe you kind of cut me off in the moment. That's fine. I'm secure enough. I'm strong enough. I'm compassionate enough to be like, okay, not taking that personal. It didn't feel good, but I realize there's something else going on. And so I can stay present in whatever they're available for. Does that make sense?
And we're playing the long game, not the short game. And for a population that many people in their lives have bailed on them, let us be the ones that don't, and that remain, and that consistency in something in their life or someone in their life that's a constant is exactly how we continue to engage, even if we're not fixing this problem immediately right in this moment. As much as many of us want to, it's the long game. So Lindy, this is the last one, we'll end with this, but if you could leave EMA advocates with one piece of advice, with one word of encouragement as they so bravely go into this uncharted territory of building meaningful relationship with these women, advocating on behalf of their needs day in, day out, what would be that piece of advice that you would want to give?
Ooh, loaded. I feel like 30 things just came to my brain. So let me try to pick one. Well, one, I first just want to say thank you for the role you're playing in these women's lives. Please check in with someone the second you start dismissing the value of it, or questioning it, of like, are we even getting anywhere?
Right.
Like, lean into each other when you're like, are you kidding me? Right? Like, I'm sure you all are happy to be that for one another. And I just want to like speak to that from my perspective, because in all that I know of relational healing, relational trauma, all of these things is, and you've probably heard this before, and I've seen it in the line of my work, and you've probably seen it some too, but remembering that it takes one safe, caring person to change an entire trajectory.
So good.
And we might need to like pep that up, right? And like tell ourselves that throughout our experiences, but remembering, and maybe you all can like agree, like when you're feeling it, I'll say that to you. I'll give you that reminder, right? Because we're all going to have those moments. But I think, again, when we even just look at a neurological level of mirror neurons, right? Of the power of modeling, of knowing that when you are like what you were just saying, a person that like didn't actually run away and didn't get too scared and shut down and didn't, see a behavior and you're like, whoa, that's just not okay. Just straight, I'm not okay. Right. When we're like actually kind and caring and loving and respectful and holding structure and bringing in problem solving, when we're like able to lean into that with people, especially these women who haven't experienced a lot of that, please don't underestimate the power of it.
Good.
And also be mindful of the repetitions it may take for them to actually get it and believe you. Because if people haven't been safe or caring or kind or consistent in the past, why are you any different? That's the lens they might be coming from. And so maybe it's just a word of encouragement of expect it to take a lot of repetitions of like, maybe they didn't really come back to you and stop shutting you out until the 38th time you kind of had the same conversation. Whereas the 37 times before, they hung up the phone or they walked away or they were like, I'm out. But for whatever reason, that maybe the 38th time, they actually stayed present with you and said, I'm actually just really overwhelmed. We don't know when they're going to actually be able to absorb it and believe it. But it is our responsibility, as much as we're able, which means we got to have some good support too, right? As much as we're able to keep showing up in those moments. That's all we can do. That was a lot in that, but I just
so
think really speaking to the power of your relationship with them, of your care, your empathy, your advocacy, your even being able to see, wow, that sounds really sad. I bet you're like, I would be sad too. Right. Just connecting with those and the consistency, I think, is really, really, really huge. Even on like neuroscience reflects that, right? Psychology reflects that. For me, I look to the Bible a lot. The Bible reflects that, right? Like the presence of showing up and being consistent and present. Presence is powerful.
Yeah.
That's the best way I can summarize
it's
it.
so good. And just scripturally, what we know is that God asks us to plant seeds and it is he who waters and grows. Do we trust him to do that? It's a reminder for us to define our win, define what success is, even if you invest months of your time into one family and you don't really see this like crescendo moment of change. That's okay. We didn't fail. We were faithful in exactly what God asked us to do. And I've heard advocates say before, I've been working with this mom for 6 weeks and nothing's changed. And I'm like, well, what was the first half of that sentence? We've been working with this mom for 6 weeks. And a good just reminder for us is Jesus is our advocate. I'm so grateful that he didn't give up on us after 6 weeks because we'd all be doomed. So let us take on that gospel-centered approach as we serve these moms. Thank you so much, Lindy, for that reminder. We're so grateful for you joining us today. We have some time for a few questions. Awesome. We'll go to the chat and we will start I'm going to start with Nikki's. When a particular scenario is triggering, i.e., let's have a talk, how can you begin to make those scenarios safe again for someone?
Great question. I actually, as much as you're able, I've used this a lot, again, more primarily in my role working with kids or teens or young adults. This idea of revisit. So let's say last week you said something like, hey, let's talk about XYZ experience. And they were super triggered. And you're like, oh, okay, we just actually needed to talk about being late, or, something kind of simple and really kind of harmless. So you're like, okay, what do I do about that? I actually really encourage, when you're really connected with that mom, when you're having a great time, I don't know what your time together looks like. Let's say you're having coffee and you're on a walk and she's great and she's really excited about, like, she actually had a big win recently, or she had a great moment with her kiddo or whatever. When she's in a good place and you two are connected and it's casual and we're not like in the thick of problem solving right now, when she feels safe and connected and happy or fun or playful, that's the best time to do more of the teaching, assessing, not teaching at her, but like kind of getting into, let's revisit something that is not a problem right now. We're looking like, hey, a week ago, that was really hard for you. And I hated the way I think you felt attacked by me, or you felt overwhelmed by my question. And I never want to overwhelm you intentionally. You kind of like go back to the scene of the crime, but when she's at a really good place, or as best of a place as you might have available to you, because maybe she's never really great. I don't know, during your time together. So you might just say, I'm so sorry that was overwhelming. I'm curious, what could I have done differently to help us lean into that conversation? Can you help me understand what part felt maybe threatening or too much for you? Because that was absolutely not my intention. And I want to prevent that moving forward if possible.
Yeah.
Right. So you're gently leading her in to kind of go back to that, but when it's not a problem right now, and assess, maybe she was like, honestly, the language, let's say for your example, we need to talk, reminds me of something in my past. So can you say this phrase instead? So maybe she's got like a replacement phrase. And if she doesn't have a replacement phrase, you can say, okay, so what if I said this instead? Better or worse? What if I said this instead? Better or worse? Right? So you're it's like you're learning together. Because the reality is, let's say you have to talk about that thing. Maybe it was paying her bills or showing up to court or something that, like, we actually have to talk about it. I can't just like let it go. But what we can do is revisit and kind of try on, okay, what could we do different? What would be less triggering for you? What would feel safe for you? Do we need to first have a good walk and connect, and then I can bring up a conversation we have to have? Do you need me to use different words, a different tone of voice? Is it best when we're in the car and we're driving and I'm not looking at you, so you feel less maybe vulnerable or intimate or intimidated? So I would check in with her in that regard, right? Of letting her lead some of it too. Because then when she's like, I just need you to say this, you're like, great, I'm going to try that. So let's say a month later, you remember that phrase and you say that phrase. She's already essentially given you the permission to use that language. So if it doesn't work out, you're still connecting. You could say, okay, let's try something else. But if it does work, right? Like, she's already bought in essentially to you using that language. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. We have one more question and then we will wrap. This is an interesting one from Kristen. How do we help a mom who has experienced trauma become self-aware when part of her survival has been ignoring her needs and doesn't believe she has any?
So she doesn't believe she has any needs. Is that? Sorry,
she's just ignoring her needs and she doesn't believe she has any. How do we help a mom in that frame of mind?
Sure. Kind of to some of our earlier conversations, modeling as much as possible. And that might look like, maybe you share something personal, right? Like, man, the other day my kid was throwing a fit and I was late for work and I spilled my coffee everywhere. And I was I was so ticked off. And honestly, I think I was
Right.
overwhelmed, but it came out as anger. And I realized in that moment, I need a 10-minute walk. I just
Mhm.
need, I need, right? Like I need, right? You're modeling
And
language of I
yeah.
have needs. And I don't know if there's a level of this woman looking up to you, admiring you. I mean, you're all awesome. So I'm sure that's mutual, right? If you admire them and they admire you. So there might be a level of, oh, this person who maybe is the helper or the one who has it together. And I say this in quotes because I don't mean to elevate or
Sure.
value any role, but if she perceives you as someone who's like got it all together, you modeling like I lost it the other day. And this
It's good.
simple thing threw off my whole day, right? Like it kind of normalizes like, oh my gosh, we're all just trying our best here, right?
Mhm.
And so I think the modeling is actually really powerful of and as much as possible, you are incorporating languages of what was your need. I realized I was feeling really lonely and I just needed some connection. And so
Mhm.
I just jumped on the phone with a friend when I was driving to pick up my kid from school. Or I asked my spouse or my friend or my sibling or my parent to just have coffee with me because I just realized I hadn't had some good connection time, right? Like model for them. And so again, like this is
Yeah,
you,
like
you've
I
got to
have
do,
needs too. Right.
yes, I have needs too. And you have to do your work too of like, are you actually aware of your needs too?
Mhm.
Right. Like it's not just like I need to sleep or eat food. There's more than that. So I think modeling, or maybe even again, if appropriate and not kind of degrading, saying like, man, if I were in that situation, I could imagine I would feel really lonely. I would feel really disappointed. And I think I would really just need someone to believe in me. I
Mhm.
think if I were in that situation, I could imagine I would need someone just to honestly buy me a cup of coffee and sit with me for a minute. I would need 5 minutes of alone time. I would need,
Sure.
what, so I think you could either model your own and, or, with depending on your relationship and this person, checking in on if I were in that situation, this is how I've
Mhm.
experienced it. I think that's a really great way to help her learn
Mm.
in a caring way.
Yeah. That also levels the playing field and is not othering of her and humanizes
Mhm.
struggle and need, because those are things we all have. And this desire to belong and be seen and get those needs met is a really great place to start as advocates. So, Lindy, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so grateful to have just learned and gleaned from your experience and knowledge in this space. So, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I love getting to see your faces, and I hope we get to talk again.